The 16th century was a time of great upheaval in Europe. The old world order was being challenged by new ideas and new powers. Spain and Portugal had dominated the scene for centuries, but now the Dutch were rising to prominence. These three countries would go on to fight each other in an intense competition for power. This rivalry would have a profound impact on the course of world history. But what many people don't realize is that this competition wasn't just about military might or economic strength. It was also a battle of wits. In fact, it was a battle of innovation, and it was here where the Dutch really excelled. They would take the ideas and concepts that the Portuguese had developed and improve upon them, which allowed them to build a global empire that would make them unimaginably rich. In this video, we're going to explore the story of how the Dutch beat the Portuguese at their own game. We'll tell you all about their most valuable innovation, and if you stick around to the end, we'll tell you about the place that they used to do it. Let's start with some context. For centuries, the only way to get to Asia from Europe was through the Mediterranean Sea. And this meant that the Spanish and Portuguese traders had a natural monopoly on the trade in spices and other luxury goods. However, this would all change when the Portuguese started to lose their grip on the seas. The Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588 signaled the end of Spain's dominance and paved the way for a new power, the Dutch. And so, in 1602, 7 northern provinces of the Low Countries revolted against Spanish Habsburg rule and founded the Dutch Republic. Now, while this was happening, another major event was taking place across the ocean in the Far East. The Chinese had been producing porcelain for centuries, but until recently, it had been difficult for Europeans to obtain. However, after the discovery of the Americas, European explorers began to make their way to China in order to purchase porcelain and other goods. As a result, the Chinese began to produce porcelain specifically for the European market. Now, up until this point, the Portuguese had been the middlemen between Europe and Asia. But with the rise of the Dutch, this would all change. You see, the Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602 with the goal of trading spices in the East Indies. It was the first global corporation and the first company to issue shares of stock. And it's because of this that it's often referred to as the world's first multinational corporation. Now, there were two main reasons why this company became so successful. First, it was able to take advantage of the growing demand for Asian goods in Europe. And second, it was able to do so more efficiently than its competitors, thanks to innovative financial practices. One of the ways that the Dutch were able to compete with the Portuguese was by issuing shares of stock in the company. This allowed anyone to invest in the company and become a part owner. And this was a novel idea at the time. Most companies were either privately owned or owned by the government. But the Dutch were able to come up with a system that allowed anyone to invest. But that wasn't all. The Dutch were also able to introduce the concept of limited liability. This meant that investors were only liable for the amount of money that they had invested. If the company went bankrupt, they wouldn't be able to lose any more than that. And this made people much more willing to invest. As a result, the Dutch were able to raise a lot of money very quickly, which allowed them to build a fleet of ships and start trading. In addition, the Dutch were also able to set up the world's first stock exchange, which allowed investors to buy and sell shares of stock in the company. This gave people the ability to make money off of their investments without having to hold on to the stock for a long period of time. And this made the company even more attractive to investors. But perhaps the most important thing that the Dutch did was that they focused on efficiency. They were able to keep their costs down, and they were able to turn a greater profit than their competitors. And this is one of the most important lessons that we can learn from the Dutch. In today's world, it's not enough to simply come up with a good idea. You also have to be able to execute on it. The Dutch were able to do this better than anyone else, and it's one of the reasons why they became so successful. Another reason for the success of the Dutch was their geographical location. The Netherlands is located in Europe, which is close to both Asia and Africa. And this made it easy for the Dutch to trade with both of these continents. In addition, the Netherlands has a lot of canals, which made it easy to transport goods. Finally, the Dutch language is similar to German and French, which made it easy for the Dutch to communicate with people in these countries. All of these factors contributed to the success of the Dutch. But one factor that I think is often overlooked is the role that geography played. As I mentioned earlier, the Netherlands is located in a very strategic location in Europe. This gave the Dutch a natural advantage when it came to trading with Asia and Africa. The Netherlands is also home to many rivers and canals, which made it easy to transport goods. This helped the Dutch to keep their costs down and to get their goods to market quickly. In addition, the Dutch language is similar to German and French, which made it easier for the Dutch to communicate with people in these countries. This is important because Germany and France were two of the main markets for Dutch goods. So the fact that the Dutch could communicate easily with people in these countries gave them a big advantage. In addition, the Netherlands is a small country with a relatively small population. This meant that the Dutch were able to focus on trade and commerce without having to worry about defending their borders. This is unlike the bigger countries in Europe like France and Spain, who had to spend a lot of money on their militaries. As a result, the Dutch were able to use their resources more efficiently, which helped them to become the dominant power in Europe. So overall, there are a number of reasons for the success of the Dutch. They were efficient, they were innovative, and they were in a great location geographically. The last of these is often overlooked, but it's important to remember that geography plays a big role in the success of nations. All right, now let's talk about what the Dutch actually did with their profits. The Dutch used their profits to build a large fleet of ships and to establish colonies around the world. They established colonies in South Africa, Brazil, and Indonesia. They also used their profits to build up their military, which allowed them to defend their colonies and to protect their trade routes. In addition, the Dutch used their wealth to commission a lot of art and architecture. The Dutch Golden Age was a time when the arts flourished in the Netherlands. Some of the most famous Dutch artists of all time lived during this period, including Rembrandt and Vermeer. Finally, the Dutch used their profits to fund scientific and technological innovation. The Dutch were responsible for some of the first major innovations in things like shipbuilding, navigation, and printing. These innovations helped to propel the Dutch to even greater wealth and power. So, in conclusion, the Dutch were able to beat the Portuguese by coming up with innovative financial practices like issuing shares of stock and limited liability. They were able to use their profits to build a strong navy, to establish colonies, and to fund scientific and technological innovation. Ultimately, the Dutch were able to build a global empire that stretched from South Africa to Brazil to Indonesia. It was a truly remarkable achievement. We should also mention that this didn't happen in just one city. Instead, this happened in one place. Amsterdam is a city in the Netherlands that was founded in the 13th century. But it wasn't until the 16th century that it began to grow rapidly. This was due to a number of factors, including its strategic location on the river Amstel and its proximity to the North Sea. This made it easy for Amsterdam to trade with the rest of Europe as well as with the rest of the world. In addition, Amsterdam was home to a number of canals, which made it easy to transport goods. Finally, Amsterdam was a tolerant city that welcomed people from all over the world. This is in contrast to many other European cities at the time, which were often very intolerant, and this made Amsterdam a very attractive place to live. All of these factors combined to make Amsterdam the perfect place for the Dutch East India Company to be based. And so it was in Amsterdam where the Dutch really flexed their muscles and established their dominance on the high seas. Today, Amsterdam is still a major financial center and home to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which is one of the oldest and largest stock exchanges in Europe. The city is also home to a number of museums, including the famous Rijksmuseum, which houses a vast collection of Dutch art and history. If you ever have the chance to visit Amsterdam, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful city with a lot to offer. One that would bring in valuable spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. But the locals had a different story to tell. This spice island was not just a source of exotic flavors for the Europeans, it was a treasure trove of riches. As they watched the Dutch sail away with sacks of spices, they knew they had stumbled upon something big. Soon, the European powers realized the potential of this trade, and they wanted a piece of the pie. The Portuguese were the first to arrive in the East Indies, followed by the British, the French, and finally the Dutch. All of them set up shop on these islands and started trading. By the mid-16th century, the competition was fierce. Each European power wanted more spices, more profits, and more control over the trade. It was a chaotic scene, a free-for-all in the name of trade. But the Dutch had a plan to outmaneuver their competitors and establish dominance in the spice trade. They would do what no other power had done before: monopolize it. They pooled their resources together and formed a powerful entity, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Chartered on March 20th, 1602, it was the world's first multinational corporation. With a workforce of 150,000 employees from all over Europe, the VOC became a financial powerhouse. Its annual revenue was more than the GDP of some small nations. And the VOC achieved this by making two major moves. Firstly, corruption and internal division among the ranks of the traders. Secondly, getting on the good books of Britain and France, who were the colonial powers at that time, and seeking their help to curb piracy and smuggling. These measures helped to decimate the Portuguese and create a duopoly between the Dutch and the British. Now, while the British were initially wary of the Dutch and did try to hinder them, the VOC's monopoly was so lucrative that they eventually came around. The British even helped the VOC establish settlements in Africa, which served as supply and refueling points for ships sailing to the East Indies. However, this alliance was not built on trust, but on convenience and self-interest. Both the British and the Dutch had their own designs on the riches of Asia, and they were not afraid to flex their muscles. By the mid-18th century, the VOC was in decline. The Dutch government, realizing the need to assert control over its unruly colony, nationalized the Dutch East India Company in 1795. And in 1796, its charter expired, and the VOC was no more. But its impact was far-reaching. The VOC laid the foundation for modern finance, multinational corporations, and colonialism. Today, the Netherlands may no longer be a seafaring empire, but it is undoubtedly a financial one. Its companies dominate the global markets, its banks control international finance, and its trade routes stretch to every corner of the globe. Even the royal family of the Netherlands, the House of Orange-Nassau, which had given the VOC its initial support, is still deeply involved in the Dutch industry today. It has stakes in some of the largest companies in the world, including Shell and the ING Group. However, the VOC's reign was not without its atrocities. The Dutch were notorious for their ruthless efficiency, and their treatment of the natives was often brutal. They enslaved the locals, exploited their resources, and massacred anyone who stood in their way. The Banda Islands Massacre of 1627, the Amboina Massacre of 1629, and the Batavia Massacre of 1623 are just a few examples of the VOC's reign of terror. So, you see, the VOC may have been a financial marvel, but it was also a brutal reminder of the darker side of capitalism: the exploitation, the oppression, and the violence. In the end, though, it was the VOC's insatiable greed that led to its downfall. Its relentless pursuit of profits led to overexpansion, mismanagement, and ultimately bankruptcy. In conclusion, the VOC was more than just a trading company. It was a pioneer of modern capitalism, a trailblazer of globalization, and a harbinger of colonialism. It changed the course of history, connecting the world like never before. But it also left behind a legacy of exploitation and oppression that continues to haunt us even today. And here's something else that might haunt you. You see, the VOC was not the only player in the game of spice trade. The British, the Portuguese, and the Chinese also had their eyes on the prize, and they too played by the rules of the game, albeit with their own strategies and tactics. Speaking of the Chinese, they had a saying that goes like this: "The man who controls the flow of water can control the world." In the case of the spice trade, it was the Dutch who controlled the flow of goods, and they used it to their advantage. They dominated the market, set the prices, and reaped the profits. But here's where things get interesting. Who were the people who supplied these precious spices to the Dutch? Who were the ones who toiled and tanned under the tropical sun, harvesting the very essence of the earth? It was the natives, the indigenous people of the East Indies, who knew the secrets of the land. They cultivated the spices, harvested them, dried them, and prepared them for trade. But as the Dutch grew more powerful, they began to take more control over the production process. They brought in their own settlers to oversee the plantations, exploit the workers, and maximize profits. They introduced new technologies and methods of cultivation, all in the name of efficiency. But the natives were not just passive players in this game. They too had agency, will, and power. They resisted the Dutch in various ways, through rebellions, through secret societies, and even through acts of individual defiance. They fought for their rights, for their land, and for their very survival. So when we talk about the spice trade, it's important to remember that it was not just about the Dutch, the Europeans, or the quest for exotic flavors. It was also about the natives, their contribution, their struggles, and their resilience. We hope you enjoyed this journey through time and trade. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more exciting historical tales. And if you're still hungry for more, we've got plenty of historical tales waiting for you. Just click on that subscribe button and ring the bell icon to never miss an upload. Until then, stay curious, keep exploring, and we'll catch you in the next one.